What's up, kitchen table wizards? What's up, deck brewers from all over the world? Today we are going to do a casual spin of an iconic deck from back in the 90s. It's built around an iconic spell in blue. Of course, you will know it. It is the Counterspell. And my intern, who is here in a virtual way, will be very happy because she loves the Counterspell.
Everything is blue.
So today I'm going to talk about not only how to play with a counter deck, I'm going to show you a nice Counterspell deck I've brewed for you that is not too expensive. I'm also going to teach you how to play against a Counterspell deck. This is mainly also to you to help your friends, because otherwise, if you play too much with a Counterspell deck against them, they will probably not want to play against you anymore. So it's for your own good. So playing with Counterspells can be really annoying for your opponents. So your strategy will be to try to deny your opponent to do anything that will affect you while you are slowly building up your board, slowly preparing for the kill. And that will probably also happen very So just to give you an idea, a real life Counterspell situation would look a little bit like this. Hey, so I had this idea.
Wait.
So I was thinking that...
Nope.
But this weekend we could...
Stop. Now go and take out the trash.
Nope.
So yeah, you notice that it's tough to be countered all the time. So give this video a like if you know the feeling of how it feels to be countered. Now there are more than 100 different sorts of counterspells. Of course, I didn't include every one of them. It would be impossible. Well, it wouldn't be impossible. Let's say it would be just difficult to shuffle with a pile of cards like that. No, what I did is I made you a nice 60 card deck with some variations in the counter spells and also some variations in the win conditions. So before we head into the counter wars, a quick shout out to my fellow friends at Cardmarket for keep supporting this channel and giving out €10 vouchers each deck. At the end of the video, I will be giving out a voucher to one of you guys. How can you participate? You might ask yourself. Well, it's very simple. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Maybe which are your 3 favorite counterspells, and then you're automatically into the raffle of the Cardmarket voucher. So today's deck is going to cost us not too much, around 25, maybe $30 or euros, and you can also find the deck list below in the description. Let's start with the deck. So as always, we start with the lands, 25 of them, because a counterspell deck needs a lot of lands and we needed something mysterious, and therefore I found this beautiful island from Brandon Kitkowski. Very mysterious little village in the middle of a waterfront. Definitely my pick for the island in this deck. And I also included 2 mystic sanctuaries and a castle ventress. Then I needed some card draw in my lands, so I included a memorial to genius and a cycling land. This lonely sandbar that was reprinted in Modern Horizons works great in the deck. I also put some defense and offense in my land. First, defensively, I've put in a Skyline Cascade. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent control doesn't untap. And the Fairy Conclave enters the battlefield tapped, but you can change it and it will become a 2/1 fairy creature with flying. So this will be already one of the win conditions in the deck. So this was the dress code of the deck, the flavor, the salt and pepper, if I may say it. Now let's head into the counter magic. Of course, I am including the original Counterspell. I only included one copy of this card because I do want to keep it friendly, keep it casual. So these powerful cards from back in the day are on my restricted list. But of course, if you're playing a Counterspell deck, you need to have a Counterspell in your deck. Counterspell is not the only 2 mana Counterspell I play. I play also an Arcane Denial, a Mana Leak and a Negate for non-creature spells. For creature spells, I included 2 Essence Scatter and also a Disdainful Stroke for spells with converted mana cost 4 or greater. So I play 7 counterspells that only cost 2 mana. Then I also play 7 counterspells that cost 3 mana. Neutralize is a counterspell with cycling. Dissolve counters a spell and has a scry 1, and Dissipate counters a spell and then exiles the card. Then I also play 1 Scatter to the Winds. It counters target spell, but you can also play it for 6 mana. And then it has Awaken. So when you cast this spell for 6 mana, you put 3 +1/+1 counters on target land you control, and it becomes a 0/0 elemental with haste. Now the cool trick is if you put those counters on your Fairy Conclave, because then your Fairy Conclave will become a 5/4 flying fairy. If you're playing mono blue, you have to play the Archmage's Charm. It costs 3 blue mana and it's a multi-flexible card from Modern Horizons that can counter you target spell, of course, but it could also draw you 2 cards, or you can gain control of target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 1 or less. And this also includes all the tokens your opponent might have. The next card maybe is a little bit of a meme, but you have to include a foil in your counterspell deck, right? You just have to. Now, of course, a counterspell deck is a control deck. So if you're a control player, you of course want to have more cards in your hand than your opponent. That's why you need card draw. I included 3 opts in the deck. 1 mana gives you an instant that scries you 1 and then draws you a card. And I also included 1 Brainstorm. For the same reason as I only included 1 counterspell, this is also a very powerful card that I've put on my restricted list. Now, of course, you can play as many Brainstorms and opts as you like if you want to build this deck. For 4 mana, I've included a Fact or Fiction. It's an instant that has you reveal the top 5 cards of your library, and then an opponent separates those into 2 piles. You put 1 pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. I also decided to play 1 Pool for Tomorrow, 2 great instant card draw spells. And why did I decide to put so many instants as card draw spells? Well, I want to play my card draw spells at the end of my opponent's turn to be safe that I've already countered his threats and now I'm refilling up my hand for the next turn. So Opportunity, of course, for 6 mana is a great instant card draw spell that draws you 4 cards. I also included 1 very cool, mysterious, legendary artifact from Throne of Eldraine in this deck. It's called the Magic Mirror. It's a legendary artifact that costs 1 less for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. When it's on the battlefield, you have no maximum hand size, and at the beginning of your upkeep, put a knowledge counter on the Magic Mirror. Then draw a card for each counter on the Magic Mirror. So when you play it, nothing will happen. You'll have a nice mirror, but the next turn you'll draw a card. The turn afterwards you draw 2 extra cards. The turn afterwards you draw 3 extra cards, and then probably your opponent just went home because he doesn't like you anymore. Next up, we also want to play some defense in a counterspell deck. Because what happens when your opponent finally resolves a spell? He gets his creature onto the board. How can you get rid of it? Well, we do this mostly by playing a few bounce spells. In my Counterspell deck I play 2 Into the Roil. It's a 2 mana instant that returns target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and if you play 2 extra mana you also draw an additional card. I also included 1 Devastation Tide. It's a sorcery and you will return all non-land permanents to their owner's hand for 5 mana. Now if you are lucky and this is the first card you draw, you can show it and play it for only 2 mana, because then it's a miracle. So to end the deck, let's still look at some support cards and of course the win conditions I decided to play. 2 defensive creatures that work very well in a Counterspell deck are an Augur of Bolas. It's a merfolk wizard and for 2 mana you get a 1/3, and when it enters the battlefield you can look at the top 3 cards of your library and you may reveal an instant and sorcery and put it into your hand. Because there is no future save the one my master wills. I often say this also to my assistant, but she never listens. Baral, Chief of Compliance, is a legendary human wizard that makes all my instants and sorceries 1 mana less to cast, and whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card, and if you do, discard a card. So this is the legendary creature you want to have into a Counterspell deck. Counterspell decks like wizards, and they also like Gadwick the Wizened. For 3 and X mana you get a 3/3 legendary wizard, and when it enters the battlefield you draw X cards. Whenever you cast a blue spell, tap target non-land permanent an opponent controls. So this card plays also very good on defense. Another horsefish that likes counterspells is the Wavebreak Hippocamp. Whenever you cast your first spell during your opponent's turn, you will draw a card. And this works very well with Opt, with Into the Roil, and of course with all of our counterspells. The 4th wizard I included into the deck is the Mystic Archaeologist. Now of course you might say this is not the best card, but I'm not only looking at the best cards, I'm also looking for flavor, and I can see already this Mystic Archaeologist drawing me a bunch of extra cards. So if you get it in the early game, it's a good blocker, and if you get it in the late game, you will draw a lot of cards with this card. I'm not sure how to pronounce the next card, but for me it's the ultimate win condition, because who doesn't like killing your opponent with a squid? This 4 mana 1/2 flying creature gets stronger every time you draw a card, and in a counterspell deck you will be drawing a lot of cards, so this weird little squid is going to be a 5/6 flying very easily. Ikoria gave us an Omnious Sea, and I've included 2 of them because also I like to draw cards, I like to put counters on this, and I like to kill my opponents with a big 8/8 Kraken token. And if it's too early, I just cycle it away and go looking for another counterspell. The last creature I play is not the Snapcaster Mage, but its big brother, the Torrential Gearhulk. For 6 mana you get a 5/6 artifact creature with flash, meaning you can play it as an instant, and when it enters the battlefield you may cast target instant card from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. So you can draw a lot of cards with it when you have some card draw in your graveyard, but of course you can also use it as a counterspell if you have a counterspell in your graveyard. So now let's talk a little bit on how to play with a counterspell deck and how to play against a counterspell deck, because you want to keep the few Magic playing friends you have around for a little bit longer. So we'll also give them a few tips, okay? First, how are we going to play this? Or how are we going to build a counterspell deck? So a counterspell deck needs 2 things to function. A lot of cards in our hand with a lot of options to counter, and a lot of mana to play those cards. So in a counterspell deck I usually include a little bit more mana than in a regular deck, and I also include a good mix of card draw and of counterspells. Win conditions, you don't need to put a lot in there, you will draw them eventually, and as long as you can keep your opponent from killing you, you will be alright. Now maybe some tips for your friends who are going to have to battle you playing that counterspell deck, or maybe just for you if you have a friend that's also playing a counterspell deck. What works great against a counterspell deck is creatures with flash, because you can play them at the end of your opponent's turn, and then even when they decide to counter it, they need to spend mana for that, and this is mana they can't use on your turn when you want to cast an even stronger creature. So keep that in mind. Another tip is to include creatures that come back, maybe with the Eternalize or the Embalm mechanic from the Amonkhet block. You can play a Sacred Cat or a Downed Pouncer. They are quite annoying because if they're countered once, they will come back. And then of course green has some cards that can't be countered, like Troon, the Last Troll, and if you want to check out a nice troll deck, click this link here. But also the Prowling Serpapart, it's a cat snake, whatever. And there's also the Spellbreaker Behemoth, it's a 5/5 for 4 mana that can't be countered. Ouch, if you're playing a counterspell deck, this is going to hurt. So these were a few tips how to play against and with a counterspell deck. Now let's head into the power rankings. A counterspell deck is a pretty powerful deck, but it also depends on who is playing with it, so you really need to know which spells to counter from your opponent. Therefore, I also gave it complexity of 7 and also a consistency of 7. A counterspell deck is probably one of the least offensive decks you can play in Magic, so you will be playing on the defense a lot of the time. Now the number of the fun factor refers to the fun you'll be having and not the fun your opponent is having. I think it's a good value for money if you invest in this deck, and it's also a good deck to learn to play better Magic. Let's now head into the metagame review. The deck doesn't do well against very aggressive decks, because on the first turns you probably don't always have a counterspell ready, and if your opponent is starting with a creature on turn 1 followed by a creature on turn 2, it can put a lot of pressure on you. When you have a little bit of time against mid-range decks, for example, it gets a lot better, and against control and combo decks you just sit back, relax, counter everything and win in the long game. To finish, I included some cards you can also put in the maybe board if you have a little bit more money to spend. I've also included some of the iconic counterspells out there. First up, two artifacts that work great in the counterspell deck: the Nevinyrral's Disc and the Perilous Vault. Both artifacts mostly destroy the whole board and reset the game, so you can have your counterspells ready for part 2. Force of Will is probably the best counterspell out there, because you can pay a life and exile a blue card from your hand instead of paying its mana cost, and then it will counter target spell. Mana Drain was an immensely expensive card when it first came out. In Legions, it's an instant and you counter target spell, and at the beginning of your next main phase you add the amount of mana to your mana pool equal to the countered spell converted mana cost. So for example, if you counter a spell that costs 6 mana, you get 6 additional mana at the beginning of your turn. Then there's also Cryptic Command. It's a counterspell like the Mage's Charm with some options. You can return a permanent to its owner's hand, you can tap all the creatures your opponent control, you can draw a card, or you can of course also counter a spell. And the cool thing is you can choose 2 of those options. And this for only 4 mana. Then I've also included a few cool counter spells like Disallow. It can counter a spell, but also an activated or a triggered ability. There's also the Insidious Will. Look at this art, it gives me the chills. This card counters a spell, or you may choose new targets for a spell, or you can copy an instant or a sorcery spell. And then there's also this old guy rewinding your lands, countering a spell and untapping 4 lands. Last but not least, I've also included an old creature from back in the day, a counterspell creature. This illusion with flash is called the Draining Whelk, and for 6 mana you get a 1/1 flying that when it enters the battlefield you counter target spell, and then you put X +1/+1 counters on the Draining Whelk, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. So it's quite similar to the Torrential Gearhulk, but then only for counters. So this was it. This was our Counterspell deck in a casual way. I hope you really enjoyed it. Give me a comment below if you like Counterspells, if you want to give me some suggestions. And I'm going to end, of course, first with the winner of the card market voucher. Drum roll, please. The winner of this week is Jeff Bakewell. Congratulations, Jeff. Look in the description below how you can contact me through Card Market. And to you and all the other people, keep it casual and see you next time. Bye.